Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens. Hi there. No Sasha this week, sadly, but instead we have just a solo episode with myself and a very, very interesting woman called Maia. Maia was trans-identified for 12 years and she's coming on for 25, so it's half her life, and she desisted recently. But the story about how she identified as trans, why she identified as trans, what was life like for her when she was deep, deep in the woods of identifying as trans, and then what brought her out. It's very, very powerful. And it moves from, middle America really over to Israel. And, she speaks so evocatively of what life was like as presenting as a man in Israel, and then ultimately ending up, in a bunker in Israel. And she talks as well about how actually she was listening to our podcast and how she ultimately desisted and what brought her to a place where she thought, I'm actually a woman and I'm a lesbian and I don't need to medically transition. So I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did.
Before we dive into the conversation, we want to take a quick moment and thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. GenSpect will be hosting the Bigger Picture Conference in Lisbon, Portugal this September. To learn more about who will be speaking at the conference and to order your tickets, visit genspect.org.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now here's the conversation.
Well, hello, Maia. How's it going?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Stella?
Good. It's great to see you. Sadly, we don't have Sasha with us today. It's just me and you. But I think it'll give us a chance to kind of get into a story that I know so many people are almost most interested in, which is the story of how does a person come to desist in this manic world where everything is so heightened and everybody has doubled down. It seems in my view, everybody has doubled down, tripled down, quadrupled down, taken their positions, and it feels so polarized these days. And you're like this flower of hope for so many people. So my little flower. So I'm hoping that you'll actually be able to, shine some light, because you have basically spent, if I'm right, half your life identified as trans, and you've just come out of it recently.
Yes, that would be correct.
Extraordinary. So take us back to when gender first arrived into your life that you noticed.
Okay, so when I was 12, I got an iPad for my birthday. The start of every great trans-identified story, I suppose. And I guess a lot of things were going on in my life at that age that I think precipitated my transgender identity. The first of which I attribute to an incident in my Arabic class when I was 12. We were engaging in the American cultural ritual of passing down a stack of worksheets, and my hand briefly brushed by the hand of one of my female classmates. And suddenly I started to feel a bunch of odd sensations in my body. My heart started to race. I became a bit dizzy, a bit discombobulated. I felt a heat rising from within my body that seemed that it was like overtaking the classroom air conditioning unit. And when I opened my mouth to apologize to this girl for the brief brush of our hands, no words came out. And I didn't know what to make of this experience. I didn't know what was going on with me. But as a kid, I was very much a medical researcher. I mean, starting from about the age of 8 or 9, I became obsessed with the world's tallest people, who I later learned all suffered from a pituitary tumor, which caused a condition called acromegaly, resulting in extreme and asymmetric growth. And I wanted to know everything there was about this condition. I wanted to know if there was a way to excise the pituitary tumor without harming the surrounding functions of the brain. So I was like knee deep in that medical obsession. And so when I had started to experience all these odd sensations in my body and I didn't know what they were, naturally, being a kid who did medical research, I thought that, any deviation away from homeostasis is a sign of pathology, which is obviously untrue because there are plenty of changes that happen to our bodies throughout, different periods of time that are natural and totally not pathological. But when you're a kid, you don't understand nuances and complexities. So naturally, I thought I must be sick with something. And I went onto WebMD and I typed in all of my symptoms, and I was generated a list of results, ranging from the common cold to like different neurodegenerative disorders that would all kill me very shortly. And I catastrophized. And so I thought I was probably dying with something or dying from something.
And it didn't occur to you fancied this girl. This wasn't in your brain at all.
No, I didn't really know what crushes were when I started to experience these feelings. I mean, my peer group talked a lot about crushes, but I thought that crush was the orange soda, and that it's a brand of orange soda that we have in the United States. And I've been told since that there are actually many flavors of this soda, but I thought it was the orange soda that my peers were obsessed with in the same way as they were obsessed with like penny boards and silly bands and Pokemon cards. Like I thought it was just another trend afflicting my, peer group, and that they would kind of get over it and move on to something else. But of course, the discussion around crushes just continued and kind of amplified as I got older. So, I didn't really understand the slang term that was crush, which meant like budding romantic affection, because I took everything very literally. So I didn't know what was actually going on with me. And so that happened. And, on one hand, I kind of thought, okay, I'm probably dying from some kind of disease, and I don't really want to know what it is. I told my parents about some of the odd symptoms, like the increased heart rate and the dizziness. But of course, I didn't tell them the context because I didn't think the context was important. And they took me to the doctor. I got tested for like asthma. I got tested, I got an EKG done, or, I got some tests. And of course, they all returned that results that I was totally healthy. So I was like, okay, fine. Like, maybe I'm dying, maybe I'm not. And so, I guess that occurred around that time. And additionally, though, like I did realize at some point, before my 13th birthday, that if I were just to hang around boys and not hang around girls, that I didn't feel all of these odd and destabilizing symptoms. So I hung around boys. We formed a strategic alliance with which we would basically incessantly prank the teachers. And we did this without really discussing why, but it seemed as if we all had the same intentions, which were to elicit laughter from the girls in the class. So that also happened kind of, I guess, right before the trans identity occurred. And then, I basically, because I was in this male peer group, I really wanted to, emulate myself after them. I wanted to become like my male peers, because really I noticed that, while they got a lot of attention from the girls, I was not getting that type of attention. And, so I also like wanted to dress like my male peers and have, stylish haircut. And I didn't really know how to express any of these desires. Like it never occurred to me to just, say, oh, I want to dress in this, and this ways, or I want to get, this type of a haircut. For some reason, I was just absolutely incapable of expressing what I actually wanted. But I did get the kind of understanding from a variety of places that it was quite unacceptable for girls to want to dress and behave in these ways. And I developed a lot of shame around what was going on with me.
Could I ask, what were you gender conforming as a child, like at 3 and 6 and 9? Were you just wearing whatever your parents put you in?
I sort of wore whatever my parents put me in, but, I don't know whether or not I was like a gender conforming or gender non-conforming child, because I was just overall an incredibly non-conforming child.
Yeah,
I mean, I read parenting
totally.
books and medical journals. Like I
I
was
can
just
see that.
I was just an odd kid. Like even the box of like this type of nonconformity or the other type of nonconformity wouldn't really fit me, because I was just all around nonconforming.
Totally. Okay. So keep going. Did it dawn on you that you could be a lesbian?
So I intellectually knew that gays and lesbians existed. It was explained to me by my parents that some men fall in love with men and some women fall in love with women. But, I didn't know what it meant to fall in love. I didn't know what any of these sensations in my body meant. I didn't know they signaled attraction. I just thought that I was like coming down with some kind of illness. I mean, I had no frame of reference. I didn't watch a lot of fictional TV. My parents and I mostly talked about a variety of intellectual topics. I didn't have very close friends because I had these really niche interests that most other kids my age didn't. Like, I don't know what, late elementary or early middle school student is interested in rare brain tumors. Like, I didn't really know that you could discuss feelings with your friends. I didn't really know how to discuss feelings in general. I was just like a very kind of confused and discombobulated, kind of quirky, nerdy type of kid. But what did put the idea in my mind that I think later resulted in the trans identity was that I grew up in a really progressive West Coast city, and I'd seen men undergoing what were called sex changes back in the day. And also I'd heard about this on the radio every now and again, because we'd listen to the radio on the way to school. And this idea came into my mind, which was like, well, I wonder if it's possible, for a girl to get a sex change and become a boy. And on this new iPad, which allowed me to have unlimited private internet access, I looked up this question and I got my answer.
Wow. And you had said earlier, I'd cut in on you about a feeling of shame. In a way, I do want to preface this with, I think a lot of us have a kind of feeling of shame around our burgeoning sexual development, be it, heterosexual or homosexual. Women generally, and sex is often shame-filled, if not, I don't know about men, but certainly women. But, you were about to speak about that. So were you starting to feel that, or was that just an instinctive almost sense of shame that you were feeling?
So it's really hard to tell because of how long ago this all occurred. Yeah. But I think that the shame came from, if I were to attribute the shame to anything, it might be the fact that, I really identified with this male peer group, and I was doing the same things that they were doing, and I wasn't getting the girls that I wanted to get, or any girls for that matter. And so I think that might have been where the shame came from. Although even at that time, I didn't even per se conceptualize it as being gay, because I didn't know that this whole prank brigade that I was running in school with my guy friends was some kind of an attempt at what would become later a dating strategy. I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing, and I didn't feel the need to interrogate it because I didn't have those cognitive or metacognitive capabilities at 12 years old.
Wow, I got it. So then you looked up kind of something like, can I be a guy, or I'd like to be a boy, and it brought you places. Tell us about that journey.
Yeah, so first, when I Googled this question, I actually, my first, I guess, encounter with the idea of, the female to male sex changes, as they were called back in those days, or gender reassignment. I was transported first into the world of medical journals because I like to read that stuff as a kid.
Your
you know?
happy place.
That was my happy place. And I was actually very proud of my medical journal obsession
Of
and
course,
consumption because,
yeah.
I was reading parenting books before then. And I thought, well, now I'm leveling up. And the truth is that most of what I read in medical journals went way over my head. But I always tried to challenge myself to understand, jargon and things of that nature. But so I thought I understood more than I actually objectively understood when I was reading these medical journals. But that's the first place I encountered it. And even though most of what was in those medical journals went over my head, I did see, a few words that I latched onto that I could spell kind of just from memory. And I would kind of start searching those words. And so I had already, by the age of 12, maybe 3 or 4 months before my 13th birthday, I already knew everything there was to know about the puberty blockers and about testosterone and about like the different types of mastectomies and genital surgeries that were available. And I knew about, the diagnostic criteria for what was at the time gender identity disorder. And after, perusing the medical journals, I realized that there were actually a few articles written about it in like pop psychology, papers. And this was in the era before there were just tons of trans influencers, of women who would show their transition timeline on YouTube, and with a classic kind of ritualistic behavior of, my name is X and this is my voice, 1 month on testosterone, 2 months on testosterone. So those videos, I know, and those videos were just starting to kind of surface.
Is this about
there weren't
2012, that many. Are we? 20, yeah, it was all starting then. Yeah, Jesus.
And the way
Keep going.
And the way that these women kind of described their, I guess, coming to their conception of their true self as a man, was really, based on one key, I guess, argument or statement that really stuck with me, which was, I thought that I was just a lesbian, just a butch lesbian, and I but now look at me, I went from this like ugly, sad lesbian to this like confident man that you see before you today. Like that was kind of a sentiment that was reiterated throughout personal accounts that I'd read of FTMs. And when they discuss what their moments of realizing that they had a quote unquote male soul, like the experiences that they kind of had written down or had conceptualized as being trans experiences are actually just lesbian experiences that have been repackaged under the trans explanation. So young lesbians are going to see themselves in those stories. And so that's where I think a lot of the danger comes in with this type of stuff.
Wow. And did you tell anybody at this stage? Did you tell anybody in school, or was this a solitary thing, or did you tell your family?
So I told my parents. I basically pulled them away for a private conversation. And in this private conversation, I said, I have to tell you something. And I couldn't get the words out. Like I felt like I was back in Arabic class, except this instance with my parents did not have those warm and kind of fuzzy emotions associated with it. This was a much more difficult, I guess, expression to make. It felt as if there was something like a block of steel that was sitting at the base of my throat that was making it impossible to get the words out. And so I made my parents guess. And
wait, did you prepare for this, or did you look up how to tell my parents? And what do you think was that block of steel? Now,
so I didn't look up how to tell your parents. I just had, I developed all of this urgency because I was deeply ashamed of what was actually going on with me. And and I didn't even have the accurate words to describe it. At first, I thought I was sick with something that might kill me. And, then the doctors couldn't find what was going to kill me. And so I just thought like I have a ticking time bomb inside my body. And then I discovered this trans explanation for the feelings of like discomfort. And just, I guess like I didn't have a real understanding of the condition that actually defined all of those experiences. And so I just felt like, okay, at this point, like I need to get it out. I'd already seen some stories of quote unquote trans kids. There were not that many documentaries back in 2012 about this subject, but there were a few that I naturally watched over and over and over again. And the main point, even back in those days, in regards to the kids, is like you need to transition them as early as is humanly possible, because once puberty has started, you're kind of already screwed. And I'd already been in puberty for a few years by that point. I started puberty quite young, and I just thought like every day that I'm not on the blockers and not on the testosterone is one more day that my growth plates are fusing, and I'm never going to be able to pass as a man. So I need to do this now. Like I felt urgency. There wasn't any kind of like real preparation.
Whoa. And did you at any point think I might be a lesbian? When was the first time? I know we might be skipping ahead, but I can't help asking. When was the first time you thought, maybe I'm a lesbian?
So, funny enough, I never used those words to describe myself until after I gave up the trans identity. But the moment in which I realized that I like girls was probably at the end of my sophomore year of high school, when I was about, 15 and almost 16. So it was years down the line. It was like several years after the onset of the trans identity that I sort of realized that, like I like girls. But by that point, in the discussion about desistance, and when we talk about desistance under the watchful waiting protocol, and it is important to note that under that protocol, we're mostly talking about, young boys, very young boys. But when we discuss like the desistance under the watchful waiting protocol, where the kids, were not medicalized and they were not imbued with a cross-sex identity, they weren't affirmed, they weren't doing any kind of, I guess, interventions, like to socially or medically reify the trans identity, the desistance rates were extremely high. And in basically every study that's been conducted about, what I guess the trajectory of these young boys is that most of them grow up to be gay, and that they kind of realize this as they're going through puberty, and that this causes them to come to more, I guess, peace with their biological sex, because, young kids, before they've experienced a sexual awakening, have a very simplistic worldview. And if you're gay, you're more likely to be non-conforming. And so like young kids will attribute that non-conformity to the sexually dimorphic, to the sexually dimorphic binary. So a little boy who likes to wear dresses might very like kind of earnestly think, oh, well, this means that I'm actually a girl. But, as they grow up and they grow into themselves and they realize they're gay, they kind of have an explanation that they can attribute their nonconformity to that does not involve a cross-sex identity. But in my case, because I guess I had a bunch of different like developmental quirks and some delays, and just a general lack of understanding of how emotions work, because I had already been imbued with this cross-sex fantasy at such a young age, even when I realized that I was, exclusively attracted to girls and now to women, the trans fantasy stuck around despite the alternate explanation.
Wow. And did you get into the trans activist side of social media? And how did your parents respond?
So I was never a trans activist.
Good.
My parents, I would say that my parents were naturally quite, freaked out by my revelation that I wanted to be a boy. And back in 2012, like there wasn't this sort of orthodoxy. I mean, in general, there wasn't much information for parents of trans-identified kids. Like it was kind of the Wild West. So like my parents didn't feel the immense pressure that parents nowadays feel, that anything they say to their kid could get their kid talking to the school, and then the school talking to child protective services. Like this, the chain of trust has been so fundamentally broken because of the capture of a variety of different Western institutions by gender ideology that's just so not psychologically or developmentally informed in any way. And so, like, I guess my parents, they did realize that this was coming from the internet. So they had some kind of parental instincts about this, and they installed spyware on my iPad. And they told me that it would notify them of every single search I make, and that I better not make these types of searches. And the spyware, because it was a really old iPad model, the spyware slowed the iPad to the point that it was basically unusable.
Oh, no.
So for all intents and purposes, I had no internet access. And so, I felt like this is very unfair. I didn't know why they were doing this. I felt angry. I felt alone. I felt like my sort of search for self-discovery had been taken away from me. And it didn't help that, I had a brother who, because we're close in age, and siblings have sibling rivalries, he sort of picked up on the fact that I didn't have internet access, and he would flaunt his internet access in front of me. So this made me, this didn't help the situation in any way. And I guess my parents thought that by taking away my internet, my desperate attempt to understand myself would stop. But that did not end up happening. What ended up happening is that...
Can I interject that all the parents, and so often online, people are so simplistic. They keep on saying to parents of trans-identified kids, just turn off the computer, just take their devices away from them. And I've met so many parents who say, it's in already. The horse is bolted. The brain worm is in their mind, and closing the internet, while it does seem to definitely have a lot of effects on people's mental health, it doesn't necessarily nullify a trans identification. Anyway, you're going to tell me what happened with you.
Yeah. So I can't make any blanket statements about different, desistance strategies for different parents. I do have some ideas about it, but as far as my particular story, when my parents took my internet away, instead of being like, okay, whatever, I lost the battle, time to move on to the next thing, I dug my heels in even further. And at school, I would use the internet to basically look up titles of books that were available in different bookstores and libraries that talked about, trans issues and gay issues as well. And I would basically just obsessively read printed books about the topics. And these printed books were even older. Like, if we're talking about 2012 as being the modern information I had in regards to trans at this time, the books I was reading were from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So, I guess I was spending a lot of time reading, which was great, but but the things that I was reading were not doing me any favors. It just kind of fed the obsession. So that would be that arc of the story.
And then what happened? You continued, as far as I know, in your trans kind of obsession, and you were ticking along in school. And so then I know that there's a sharp move. So what happened between then and what made the move happen?
Yeah. So because I knew that this trans identity was a really sticky subject that I didn't want to discuss with my parents, and that they didn't, they also they didn't want it to exist. And I also didn't want it to exist. I didn't want to be dealing with all these feelings. And so I kind of buried it into the back of my mind. And I just thought, okay, this isn't going to happen for me now, but testosterone is a powerful drug. I'll be short, but I'll still be able to do this transition when I'm older. So I put so much, stake into that notion. And from the moment that I went to university, I started my social transition. And, this social transition, the first part of it happened in the context of an American college campus where they already, had all of these intricate pronoun rituals. And of course, even when I was trans-identified, I hated those pronoun rituals because I didn't want to be trans. I wanted to be a man. So I was existing in this kind of pronoun bubble la la land and going on with my transition. But, there were like trans and gay communities. And I spent some time in those, although I didn't find much fulfillment within them because they weren't the kind of intellectually stimulating communities that I was actually craving. And so instead I joined the Arab Student Union and started hanging out with a bunch of Arabs because I'd been studying Arabic from a young age and I really wanted to practice. So I wasn't, incredibly, I guess, entrenched within the college trans community, which I think did kind of work in my favor. But, at some point, my parents realized that this trans identity was not going away. And so they put a few stipulations in place and they said, look, if you want us to continue paying for college, you're not going to medicalize and you're going to study abroad in a country that doesn't support all of this stuff. So, I couldn't pick a country. I couldn't pick a Western country. I couldn't pick a European country. I had to pick a country that I guess wasn't imbued with this kind of, gender ideology at every corner. So I'd previously been to Israel on an 11-day trip to study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I went with a girlfriend. And after the institute was over, this girlfriend and I extended our trip, and we had some really fun adventures in the West Bank, in the Palestinian territories. There was, I guess, one time when we were going from one city to the next in a shared taxi, and we got off at the wrong stop, meaning that we ended up in the wrong city entirely. And because Google Maps were not launched in the West Bank at that time, we had to use the old-fashioned method of asking people verbally for directions in order to figure out how we're going to get to the next city. So my girlfriend and I, with our massive suitcases, walked into this coffee shop. And the owner of the coffee shop could tell that we were tourists, probably because of the suitcases, and he welcomes us in. We sit down, he gives us free coffee and free hot dogs. We have a really fascinating conversation. He tells us that he has family in the United States, and my girlfriend and I look around at, this cafe, and the only people we see around us are men. And this is because in Arab countries and cities, it's a very homosocial culture, meaning sex segregated. So there are kind of implicitly, locals know that there are certain places that men congregate and other places where women congregate. But of course, tourists are not expected to know these cultural nuances. So tourists can get away with a lot that locals can't. So, we were talking to this coffee shop owner, and I tell him that I actually speak some Arabic. And his eyes light up, and we start speaking in Arabic, and he refers to me in the masculine. And that's the moment in which I realize that he perceived me as a man, and that actually it was my girlfriend who is the exception to the no women in the cafe implicit rule. So when my parents had made me kind of consider study abroad opportunities to try to get me to desist, and it couldn't, be happening in a Western country, I realized that actually precisely because of how strict the gender norms are in the Middle East, that, I could do what I've always wanted to do and live my life as a man. So I signed up to study abroad in Israel, and
with a plan to live like a man.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, keep going. And did you live as a man?
So when I moved to Israel, in my university studies, everybody knew me as a woman because that's what was listed on my documents. But outside of the university, I'd started to develop this really rich double life, both within the Palestinian sector of the society and within the ultra-Orthodox Jewish sector of the society, as well as just within broader secular Israeli society. So I was really I had one foot in each sector of this very like ethnically diverse society and religiously diverse as well. And at some point during the academic year, the coronavirus pandemic hit. And so all the international students were going home, but I didn't want to go home because I loved living my life as a man. I wanted to stay there. And I got to speak 4 languages every day. And I got to connect with, all different sectors of this society that most locals would not even necessarily have contact with because of the language barrier. So I felt like I was really getting a very in-depth look into this society that is subject to so much political discussion and debate. And so I was thoroughly intellectually stimulated. And of course, I loved living my life as a man. So I decided to stay. And I wanted to, because I'm Jewish, pursue the process of becoming an Israeli citizen. But this process, unbeknownst to me, I was told originally that as an American citizen, this process would take maybe 9 months. But because of my Jewish roots being in the former Soviet Union, the bureaucratic institutions did not know how to handle my case. And they kind of tossed me around between 5 different agencies. And one agency would say, "You're not our problem, you're somebody else's problem." So they'd send me to the next one. And anyways, this catalyzed in me being in Israel without any kind of like definite legal status for 3 years. And this is important in my story because I didn't have, really any rights. I didn't have a worker's visa and I didn't have access to healthcare. So I couldn't medicalize.
Oh.
So what ended up happening? Oh, sorry. Repeat that.
Well, that's a biggie. You couldn't medicalize. So you were kind of being perceived as a man by strangers, but you were being perceived as a woman within the university. You were kind of in almost a safe place in terms of parents' eyes. Well, I would think that if I was your parent, I think.
Right, exactly. I mean, I was clearly very, gender nonconforming in my appearance, because otherwise I would not have been able to be perceived as a man without medicalizing. And of course, I wore a breast binder. And yeah, I guess it did feel like kind of a safe place because if the university sent anything home to my parents, it would still have my legal name on it. And so it did feel as if I was kind of in a safe place, but, I was always paranoid about people finding out the truth. And because I didn't have a definite legal status during that time, I had to take a bunch of cash jobs. And mostly I was doing like catering and cleaning within the ultra-Orthodox Jewish sector of the society. So by day, I was dressing up like an ultra-Orthodox Jewish man. I was wearing, the yarmulke. I was wearing the white shirt, the black pants. I wore the whole getup. I mean, I was in it, and but like people were none the wiser. Like I'm still to this day shocked that nobody really like figured me out. So I was doing this by day, and by night I became like really involved in Israeli-Palestinian peace activism. So I've always been somewhat of an activist, but gender, until recently was never really the cause of my activism or the sort of subject of it. So, I was living this very fulfilling life, as a man, multiple layers of double lives. Very few people knew the truth. And then something happened, which I believe catalyzed the process of my desistance. So I really attribute the start of my desistance to living through my first war in Israel in May of 2021. I was with a different girl at the time, and we were preparing to head out to a concert. And as we approached the door, we heard a siren. And I look at her and I'm like, "What is this?" And she's like, "Oh, they're launching rockets at us." And I'm like, "Well, aren't we supposed to do something?" And she looks at me and she said, "We need to go to a bomb shelter." And then I asked her, like, "Where's the bomb shelter?" And she says, "I don't know. I'm new to this neighborhood." So we were both panicking, and there were a couple cats in the house. We had to pack them up. And the first few sirens, we didn't know where the bomb shelter was. So we just went to the lowest level of the apartment because you're less likely to get hit by a rocket or by rocket debris if you're on the lower level as opposed to the upper level. And eventually we figured out where the bomb shelter was. And so every time we heard a siren, we knew we had about 2 minutes to get to the bomb shelter. And there was one time that we didn't make it to the bomb shelter in time. And so my girlfriend and I and the cats were kind of crouching under a tree, and we see 3 rockets go above our heads. one right after the other. They're ripping through the air. The ground underneath me is shaking and the siren is blaring. And I really had to contend with my own mortality. And I had this fleeting thought, which was like, what if right now I were laying in a hospital bed, recovering from top surgery, from a radical elective double mastectomy, and I couldn't move my hands above my shoulders and I heard a siren and I needed to run? What would come of me then? So I had this fleeting thought, and of course I didn't really follow up on it because I was running from rockets. But, living through that war really catalyzed a bunch of processes which didn't cause me to desist immediately, but it did start the process of questioning. For those 11 days during that war, I totally put my life on hold. I didn't shower at all because I was scared that I would hear a siren while I was showering and I'd have to run to a bomb shelter with a towel wrapped around my body and soap in my hair. So I just didn't shower. And the only way that I could take my mind off of, this kind of existential dread that I was facing, and really the uncertainty of knowing when the next siren is going to come, the only activity that I could really do was an activity that I could stop doing at any moment in time, which was spending hours on social media. So I was on Instagram and I was seeing my leftist American friends basically, justifying that Israelis should have to live under rocket fire, justifying, every terrorist action done in the name of the Palestinian people. And frankly, at that point in time, I thought that these leftist American friends of mine, none of whom had actually checked in on me to see if I was okay, I thought that, they support this terrorist group because they don't realize that Hamas are terrorists, right? They're naive. That was my thought. So I spent hours online, researching and gathering data in an attempt to basically formulate a really strong, cogent, kind of evidence-based argument to get the point across to my friends that even if they don't care about the Jews, which I had already come to understand that they didn't, that they shouldn't support Hamas because Hamas is a terrorist group that, when it is not hell-bent on destroying Israel and the Jews and then the rest of the West, it is hell-bent on destroying the lives of the Palestinian people. And I thought, surely, these kids who are making these false claims, I know them from high school debate. Like, we've all received the same rhetorical training. We've all learned, how to utilize ethos, pathos, logos, and evidence, and, how to stay away from different logical fallacies and kind of how to contend with dissonant arguments. Like, we all had that same training. And so I thought that if I just made good enough arguments, they would be able to consider my arguments and incorporate those arguments within their logical calculus. But that ended up being patently false. Instead of considering my arguments and coming to a more comprehensive understanding of a conflict that was going on thousands of miles away, they started slinging insults at me. They called me a colonizer and a settler sympathizer from their comfortable couches in the United States while I was running from rockets. And so a couple things happened from that moment. The first of which is that I became incredibly disillusioned with the Western left, because I'd come to the conclusion that all of these friends of mine, who were some of the, most intelligent people that I had ever met at that, by that point in time, that actually their opinions were not really founded upon any plasticity towards accepting new evidence, but rather, that they were ideological as opposed to logical. So that's the first thing that happened. And the next thing that happened is that because I had done so much research in an attempt to convince my friends to not support terrorists, the algorithms had started to suggest to me more content that was ideologically in line with the pro-Israel position, which had become a right-wing position in the newest iteration of the raging American culture wars. So the algorithm started suggesting me all kinds of right-wing content, starting from Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, and then eventually content which ended up being very critical of the transgender movement. And
which is not, may I say, right-wing content, but often gets positioned as right-wing content. Carry on.
Yes, of course. Yes. I mean, the algorithm is not an incredibly nuanced machine. But yeah, so I was starting to see all of these, different videos talking about the men in women's sports. And I think it's important to add that actually the first kind of trans critical content that I had ever sort of upon my own volition found or consumed was actually an English language documentary that was dubbed in Russian and featured on Russian language media, because I was doing a lot of research in Russian during the war to see how this was being covered in Russian. Yeah. So the first, I guess, encounter with gender critical content happened in Russian. And I think this actually kind of helped me to distance a lot of my, emotions from consuming the content, because I was not used to speaking so much Russian as I did in Israel. And so I think that linguistic kind of element helped, instead of being so angry about being exposed to arguments that threatened my worldview, I instead was more focused on trying to understand like what every single word meant. So, I think that, and this is something I've never discussed before, but I think it's really important. Like, I think that, language, we know that language is really important within all of these discussions around trans. I mean, the movement for gender ideology is really one that's based on linguistic and logical obfuscation by changing the meanings of words that we've always like collectively understood to mean very specific concepts. Now, the trans movement is trying to change the meaning of all of these words so that they become like functionally meaningless. So I think the linguistic element of just having to cognitively deal with consuming the information in a different language kind of, I guess, helped distance me from all of the emotions that happen to someone when their worldview starts to be threatened in any kind of way. But because I had watched that documentary, I got even more trans-related, content, but from the more critical angle. And I started to see the testimonies of detransitioners start to pop up on my YouTube. And the first video of a detransitioner that I saw, I clicked on it and I watched the video. And, because I've always been fascinated by anomalies. And the trans activists say that detransitioners and regretters are the anomalies. I mean, they say that knee surgery has a higher rate of regret. Oh, yeah. And I believe that regret was incredibly rare. And I thought, well, look, before I further embark upon this journey, I should probably know why people who regret it. And I started to watch, the videos of detransitioners, and I didn't relate to those stories. Actually, watching those first detrans stories really, I guess, cemented the trans identity for me, because the ways in which these young women, discuss their transition, especially through photos, and we know the photos are very powerful. They would show photos of themselves as young girls, very gender conforming. Then they went on testosterone. They looked very much like men. And then they were speaking for the camera as detransitioned women. And they had a very kind of typical feminine appearance, and they were often heterosexual. And when they discussed, the moment in which their kind of trans fantasy popped was, they would discuss it in words such as, I knew that I wasn't trans, or that I had made a mistake because I missed wearing makeup and leggings. Oh, and I felt I had to do that in secret. And I didn't relate to this story. That's not you at all. That wasn't me even remotely. And those were the only stories that were out there. And so I thought, well, this is even more evidence, for the fact that I'm a true transsexual, especially because the algorithms had just kind of, placed me within all kinds of different gender critical conversations, including, conversations that were more consistent with the true trans ideological camp, different flavors of gender critical. Oh God, yeah. And so I was like, really, this became my newest obsession. And then I became, obsessed with the idea that I was really like a true transsexual. So I was consuming a lot of content. I was doing a lot of reading. And, throughout that process, what I realized is that the true transsexual is really just a very gender nonconforming homosexual. And this realization came about at the same time as I started to do, more research into the evidence base surrounding these medical procedures and interventions themselves. And the evidence, showed itself to be, based on incredibly methodologically flawed studies, and based on a lot of assumptions made by the researchers who basically didn't even test their assumptions. Like the Dutch researchers made all kinds of different assumptions. The first one being that there is such a thing as gender identity. And then they just kind of moved on forward from there, from a bunch of different assumptions.
It's such a good point. I'd like to just point out, because people made such a big deal. Oh, Judy, you're a different cohort from the, old style transsexuals, without anybody saying, wait, hang on a second. Gender identity as a concept. It's never, there's never been any substantial evidence base at all to suggest that this concept is real. And from there, we were, what's called the fruit of the rotten tree. From there, we had gone askew, if you follow me. Everything from there is wrong, because there was a fundamental presumption right at the beginning. This is such a fascinating conversation. Listeners often tell us they feel frustrated by the lack of nuance around this issue, and they feel afraid to speak their minds.
And they ask us how they can help to bring more clarity to this difficult topic at their workplace, in their kids' schools, or with their own friends and family. Well, here are 3 things you can do right now.
1. Follow. Wherever you're listening to this, take a second to click like, follow, or subscribe.
2. Share. Send this podcast to anyone who you think might appreciate it.
3. Join. Support our efforts by becoming a paid Substack supporter. Go to widerlenspod.com now to subscribe.
Now back to the discussion.
I do remember first meeting you. It was the first time I met you, and it was the GenSpec conference in Killarney in Ireland. It was our first conference, actually, in, I think, April 2023. And from what I could see, you were going through something at that weekend. I remember there was a lot of detransitioners at the conference. It was a nice buzz. It was a good buzz. Where were you at? Where was your brain at that point?
So at that point, I had just lived through, I believe at that point it was 2 wars in Israel.
Wow.
And I guess wars just make you really just reorganize your entire set of priorities, and the things you thought were important before become less important. And then what truly becomes important is survival and basically staying sane. So I was dealing with the aftermath of that. And then I was dealing with, all of these kind of questions about my identity and about, I guess I was just starting to question the entire house of cards that I'd built my entire sense of self on from a very young age. And I ended up at that conference, I had just become a couple months before legal in Israel, so I could leave the country. I became a citizen, and then I could actually leave. And so I ended up at this conference, and I met many detransitioners, and I was still very much living my life as a man for years after I began to question whether or not any of this was real. And so I met detransitioners, and there were a few detransitioners at the conference that were masculine lesbians. And upon meeting them and talking with them, it's almost as if the category of woman had just inexplicably opened up to include somebody like me in it. It was pretty incredible. And for the first time, I heard stories really that I could relate to of women who do these interventions and regret them or were medically harmed by them. Because, of course, the medical harm exists totally independent of whether or not somebody assimilates that experience as regret. So I developed a lot of clarity. And at the conference, there were presentations that really went into depth about the incredible lack of evidence base of these treatments. So I think that conference and the friendships I made with the detransitioners really sort of helped orient me towards a much more solid notion that, I really should not be embarking upon a medical journey, and that there's no matter how badly I want it, that it's not in my best interest to do so. And you would think that that would be the moment that I desisted fully and detransitioned and started living my life as a woman, but that would be incorrect. So after the conference, I went back to Israel, and I was much more ambivalent about my transition. because I realized that, it was built on a stack of lies. But at that point, I didn't know how to undo it, because remember, I was living in a very religious society where I had been like giving high fives to men. And in some of those like religious cultures,
Yikes.
you're not allowed to touch anybody of the opposite sex, even in like a high five or something like that. So like I had developed this really complex social web. I was doing, peace activism. I was working with children. Everybody knew me as a guy. And I didn't know how to unravel myself from this entire web, especially in regards to the children, because at that point, like even when I was at the height of my trans identity, I still thought that this subject should never be exposed to kids. I really like deep down had wished that I had never been exposed to this concept in the first place, even though I found it to be a satisfying explanation for my distress and my nonconformity. And I believed that, on one level, that we shouldn't lie to kids about ourselves, our sex, their sex, or about reality. But another fundamental logical and moral premise that I work from is that we shouldn't expose kids to the idea of trans in the first place. And of course, these two moral premises fundamentally conflict, because coming clean about the lie would entail exposing the kids to these ideas that I think are false and harmful and developmentally detrimental.
So what did you do?
So I stayed living as a man, but I had a few friends that knew that I was female, and I started to confide my doubts in them. And anyways, I, continued with my life living as a man, but I didn't really believe in what I was doing anymore. I just didn't know any other way of being. And I think the moment, that really gave me that final push out of the trans identity, I would say was actually on October 7th, because my plans to go to the music festival, one of which was raided by Hamas, had been foiled because our sober driver dropped out. I had decided instead to on the day before, when I was supposed to go to the festival, I decided instead to do a peace event with Jewish and Arab children in a Bedouin village. And it was such an incredibly optimistic event because, you had Jewish kids and you had Arab kids, and they didn't speak the same languages. And all of their parents were there, and we were in the environment and atmosphere of a village, and we were having a birthday party for a couple of the kids. And it was such an optimistic experience because like if a kid fell down and got hurt, it was like the nearest adult to them who would comfort them. And it didn't matter whether or not that adult was from the same religion, the same ethnicity or nationality, or even spoke the same language. It was just this kind of collective understanding that, we are here as adults to create an experience for all of these kids so that they grow up understanding that they are not each other's enemies, but that they are each other's neighbors and potentially each other's best friends. That was kind of the message that we were trying to instill in these kids because, the societies do not instill those types of messages. And so we wanted to be kind of an antidote to that. And after this, event with the kids on October 6th, I made a variety of Instagram posts discussing how optimistic I was and saying something to the effect of, guys, like, look at what we can do if we just put our heads together and educate our kids together and teach them each other's languages. Like, we can't count on any of the politicians in this region. We can't count on the terrorist groups in the region. And we can't count on like international weapons manufacturers who have their grubby little hands all in this conflict to try to resolve it. We have to create some kind of on the ground peace. Like we have to do this for the sake of the kids. And I was just talking about, how optimistic I was seeing that at the end of this peace event, the kids had picked up a few words in the other language, whether it be Arabic or Hebrew. And then, so I went back home and on October 7th, I woke up at 8 a.m. to a siren. And at first I thought that they were just testing the siren because they do that every now and again, but usually they'll alert you to it. And back when I was in the university, they would of course tell us that today they're, going to test the siren. Because none of us could read Hebrew at that point in time. So somebody had to convey it to us. And so by this point in time, by October 7th, 2023, I already spoke really quite fluent Hebrew. And I went online and I started searching, to figure out whether or not they're testing the siren. And I couldn't find any evidence for the fact that they were testing that siren. And because we were not used to getting rockets during war in the city that I lived in, I was really discombobulated. Like I just thought that there must be some explanation other than war that this is happening. And I didn't have a ton of time to figure out what was actually going on. Because from the moment I heard that first siren, I heard in rapid succession many more sirens and multiple explosions after each one, which was not something I had experienced in previous wars. I was not used to hearing more than one explosion, meaning one interception of a rocket after each siren. But on October 7th, we were getting like dozens of sirens, very close together, and each one was followed by multiple interceptions that kept getting closer and closer, and like the building just was shaking. And so anyways, from the moment I heard this siren and realized that it isn't a test and that we're in a war, like I didn't have time to put my binder on. I didn't have time to wriggle myself into this binder because it's an extremely uncomfortable garment. It's very tight. It's very constricting. And especially when you're nervous and you're sweaty, and so your body is kind of like wet, it becomes even more impossible to put on a binder. And frankly, I didn't have the time to do it. And I was really quite panicked about this because everybody in that neighborhood knew me as a guy. So even as there were like sirens going off and rockets headed in my direction, I was still in the back of my mind worried about somebody seeing the fact that I had breasts. And all of these thoughts happened in very, very rapid succession. Like I'm discussing them in a very slow and measured tone now. But in my mind, I mean, this was just snapping my fingers, one thought, right after the next. So, I just layered on a bunch of shirts, hoping to obscure the presence of my breasts, and then I just ran for it. And the sirens were happening in such quick succession that I had to basically just focus on survival. Like the thought of binding just kind of got pushed more and more to the back of my mind. And of course, feeling my body move for the first time, totally unconstricted by anything, was both psychologically and physically extremely, painful and uncomfortable. But it was in those moments that I realized that, while I had previously thought that my healthy female body existing in its natural state was existing in a state of pathology that needed to be remedied with dangerous and experimental procedures, in those moments when I was running from rockets, I really came to the intimate understanding that actually my body is all I have. That my body is not pathological, that my body is capable, and that I need for my body to remain fully intact in order to be able to survive whatever chaos life throws at me. So that was a pretty significant moment for me that I had. And I think what allowed me to sort of marinate in those thoughts was that following the conference in Killarney, I had downloaded a bunch of episodes of the Gender Wider Lens podcast.
Yay!
And
good.
And this is something that I actually learned from my previous wars, because of course bomb shelters don't have Wi-Fi in them, and so they're incredibly depressing places to be because you're just kind of stuck contending with your own mortality and you have no way of distracting yourself. So I had downloaded these episodes of Gender Wider Lens, and when I spent all this time in the bomb shelters, I just had some headphones in and I was just listening to your voice and Sasha's voice on repeat in my head. And I think this was really priming my brain to come to those conclusions.
That's an extraordinary story, Maia. Really, really extraordinary. It's very, very powerful to hear the whole arc of somebody's story. I'm so glad that you managed to come out of it. I'm horrified that it took such really terrible events for it to kind of almost jolt you into another way of thinking. But there's a lot to be learned from it, and so maybe we'll move that into the bonus content where we'll talk a little bit about how you came to desist, and maybe any sort of pointers you could say that what worked and what didn't work for people who loved you, maybe parents and other people. You know what I mean? Because I think a lot of people feel like they're kind of driving blind. They don't know what works and what doesn't, and it's very individual to the person. But would be nice to hear about what worked for you and what didn't. But thank you so much for telling your story. It was really, really powerful.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.